we go now to another dear friend, which is Greg Archer. Greg is a very vocal person in the Transport and Environment Organization, which is, as you all know, in Brussels, one of the most vocal organizations to preserve the environment as much as possible. And as you will see immediately, Greg is coming with the vision of TND regarding the future of transportation, of course, on a sustainable way. Greg, please.
Well, thank you very much. Could I have the ability to share my screen, please? Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a great honor for me to speak here, and thank you for the opportunity. As was said, I'm Greg Archer. I'm now the UK Director of the environmental group Transport and Environment. I was formerly the Vehicles Director for a number of years based in Brussels. Transport and Environment's vision is very much around a sustainable shift to zero carbon transport that is both affordable and limits the impact on other environmental issues. And we have, as I said, a lot of success over the last few years in driving European regulations to be more sustainable overall. Europe has now the world's most ambitious car and truck CO2 regulations in the world that we help to shape. We've had a lot of success encouraging the phase out of unsustainable biofuels like palm oil. We did a lot of work exposing the breadth of the Dieselgate scandal, that it went far beyond Volkswagen. And we've worked in other areas, encouraging a shift away from dirty shipping fuels and creating a market for aviation emissions in the ETS. So T&E is a very wide-ranging organisation, and I'm very glad to be able to share some of our thoughts today on how to achieve a transition. I still can't share my slides because share slide is disabled. Can somebody enable it, please? Is that possible for somebody to enable me to share my screen?
Dacă ne aude cineva în studio, să-i facem lui Greg share screen, să-l enable. It's coming, Greg, it's coming.
Got it.
Yeah, now you have. Voilà.
So the debate about whether we need to take action to decarbonise transport and our economy is now clearly over. 5 years ago, the Paris Climate Agreement committed the world to decarbonise in the second half of this century and to try to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, achieving 1.5 degrees only of warming may not now be possible, but we're currently on a trajectory to 3 degrees, and we could certainly bring that down to a maximum of 2 degrees of warming if we take all of the steps which are both cost effective and possible to do in the remaining time available. And we know that this shift is now happening globally. 30 countries around the world, plus California and the EU, have now committed to achieve net zero emissions, most by 2050, some a little bit earlier by 2040, and even China most recently by 2060. But we will not be able to achieve net zero emissions unless we fully decarbonise our vehicles. And achieving that, as we can see, is going to be a huge undertaking. Transport emissions largely from vehicles, nearly a half from cars and vans, 20% from trucks, and the remainder largely from aviation and shipping, are still rising. And we are well off the trajectory that we need to be following if we are to achieve that zero emissions target. But as Andy said, there is a whole host of new technologies which are becoming really viable in terms of being able to enable us to accelerate a very rapid transition to zero emission vehicles. And at the heart of that will be electrification of transport, which does the heavy lifting in terms of reducing those emissions. Yes, we will also need to take steps to reduce the need to travel. We can do that by increased home working and remote working, and we can encourage in urban areas a shift to lower carbon modes to help reduce carbon emissions overall. We can make our trucks more efficient. We can reduce empty running and things of that sort. We can reroute aircraft so that they use less fuel. But ultimately, all of these things will make a relatively small contribution to the overall reduction in CO2 which is needed. To achieve the net zero target, and particularly zero emission vehicles, we have to change the fuel. We have to stop burning fossil fuels and find viable alternatives. And at the heart of all of those viable alternatives is, as Andy has said, this enormous transition to much cheaper renewable electricity. For cars and vans, and probably urban delivery vehicles, the debate is now over. It will be almost overwhelmingly battery electric vehicles which provide the propulsion in the future. Plug-in hybrids are an expensive transitional solution, and I would expect to see ICE cars, new ICE cars, rapidly reducing their sales from 2025 onwards and be virtually eliminated from the market by the early 2030s. With trucks, I think there is, particularly long-haul trucks, there is a bigger question of which technology will emerge. Will it be battery electric solutions? Will it be electric road systems? Or will it indeed be hydrogen? But in each case, it is renewable electricity that underpins the creation of those alternative powertrains and fuels. In shipping, for short sea shipping, batteries are entirely viable and already in use in local ferry systems. For longer haul distances, international shipping, hydrogen or more likely ammonia fuel cells look to be the most promising solution. And even in the most difficult sector to decarbonise in transport overall, in aviation, we have the opportunity to use synthetic fuels, which can replace the fossil kerosene we use today, possibly supplemented by small amounts of advanced biofuels. But we can see that at the heart of all of these transitions is the shift to renewable electricity. And it's therefore extremely important that we use this renewable electricity as efficiently as we can, because we are also going to need to use renewable power in our industry and quite possibly in our homes for heating too. So renewable power is not going to be available in infinite amounts, certainly not by 2050. So that we have, we need to use it as efficiently as possible. And the most efficient use of electricity is to use it directly, as you would in a train or with an overhead line, or to store it in a battery and then use it. And overall, those systems use about 3 in every 4 electrons to actually propel the vehicle, a very efficient system overall. If instead we use hydrogen in fuel cells, then the efficiency of the overall system drops considerably. At present, just 1 in 3 of those electrons are being used to actually propel the vehicle. And whilst that will improve over the next few years, by 2050, it's unlikely to be more than about 42% efficient. If you want to create synthetic fuels, then the challenge is even greater. There, only 1 in 4 of the electrons are currently being used efficiently to propel the vehicle. And with a synthetic gas, then the efficiency levels are even lower. So what we can see from this chart is a very clear hierarchy in terms of the way in which we need to use electricity in transport in order to minimise its use overall, given that we will not have an infinite supply for the foreseeable future. Now, analysis by Transport and Environment, represented on this slide, shows how much a complete switch away from oil to hydrogen, synthetic fuels or battery electric vehicles, how much electricity will actually be required to power those vehicles. And I'd particularly today like to focus on the question of trucks, where there is much bigger debate these days about whether or not it will be batteries, hydrogen, or electric road systems, or possibly synthetic fuels, which are the technology which will emerge as superior. If we switch to battery electric trucks, our analysis shows you need about another 476 terawatt hours of energy. That represents about 15% of current EU generation in total. However, if you switch to a fleet of hydrogen trucks, you'd need 1,200 terawatt hours of energy to create that hydrogen. That represents a third of current EU generation. And if you wanted to use synthetic fuels, you'd need 2,200 terawatt hours of energy. That's equivalent to 2/3 of total EU generation, just to create the fuel to power our trucks. Now, the head of the German Car Industry Association said in the last week that the climate problem was not a problem with the engine and the vehicle, it was a problem with the fuel. And all we need to do is to replace the fuel and switch to synthetic fuels. But I think what you can see is this analysis very clearly shows that the amount of energy needed if we were to switch wholesale to synthetic fuels is entirely unrealistic. We cannot create this level of renewables in the time which would be needed to achieve this conversion. So what is needed is we will need synthetic fuels, but as Andy said, we will need them in aviation. And even there, if we switch to synthetic fuels in aviation alone, you still need over 900 terawatt hours of energy, representing a vast quarter of the EU's total electricity generation. So we can clearly see that if we switch to synthetic fuels, we will also need to reduce the amount of flying which we are doing, because it's probably unrealistic to be able to make all of that synthetic fuel that planes will actually need. However, as I will show you in a moment, it may be possible to use some hydrogen too. Now, the other point to raise here is that gas is not a solution either. Fossil gas has no real benefits over fossil diesel once you take into account the upstream methane leakage. And biomethane simply can't be made in the quantities that we need. There isn't enough waste food and waste agricultural product to be able to produce all the biomethane that we need. And besides that, biomethane will also be needed in industry and in heating. If we start to grow vast numbers of crops to go into anaerobic digesters, then there will be indirect and direct land use changes as a result, reducing the greenhouse gas benefits of that fuel. So what we can see overall is, again, gas is not the solution. And neither, sadly, will be biofuels. Biofuels may have a role, particularly advanced biofuels in aviation, but they are not the silver bullet that was conceived at around the turn of the century. We know that the land required to grow biofuels is so vast that it just encourages more deforestation. And as we can see here, for two of the main oil seeds which are used around Europe, palm and soy, they are already creating enormous deforestation, such that if you burn a litre of palm oil, it's actually 3 times worse for the climate than a litre of diesel would be. So again, it points to the need not just for electric vehicles, but to use that electricity as efficiently as we can. Now, T&E's analysis on trucks shows that with positive policy support, price parity between diesel trucks and electric trucks, whether on electric road systems or battery electric systems, could be achieved by the mid-2020s for urban delivery vehicles, and city diesel bans in particular would be a very powerful driver for encouraging that switch to zero emission urban delivery vehicles. And very soon after that, we can start to replace the regional deliveries. The trips of typically 150 to 200 kilometres, operated by largely 26-tonne vehicles, because these are also entirely feasible using batteries. If we charge at the depot and we charge at the destination, then those trucks can easily operate and be highly cost effective too. There is, of course, a bigger question about what we do with our long-haul trucks, the 44-tonne vehicles that in some cases make trips of over 1,000 kilometres. And there, I think there may be definitely a role for hydrogen or possibly for electric road systems if batteries don't continue to develop in the way which is needed. But whether or not it's hydrogen electric road systems or batteries which eventually emerge for the long-haul trucking sector, we are going to need strong public policies to incentivise a rapid transition. That is likely to require higher diesel taxes, exemptions from the Eurovignette charges for zero-emission vehicles, and investment in a viable charging network or refuelling network for the zero-emission trucks of the future. The industry is starting now to gear up. Both Volvo trucks and Renault trucks started production of zero-emission vehicles in 2019. Daimler Trucks and MAN plan series production from 2021. But DAF, Scania and Iveco are rather lagging behind and do need to catch up. This switch is partly being driven by the newly adopted heavy-duty vehicle CO2 emissions regulations, but it's also a requirement that's being driven by its customers, the customers of the truck makers. And we're particularly seeing companies like DB Schenker and DHL wanting to embrace this new technology. So with a combination of the drive from the automotive industry, strong public policy support, and the hauliers themselves starting to make this transition, we will see a rapid shift to zero-emission trucks, just as we are seeing a rapid shift to zero-emission cars. Now, interestingly, just as we may see different parts of the truck market switching to different technologies, I think it may also be the case that we're able to see different parts of the aviation sector also shifting to different technologies. Batteries will never be able to fly a plane across the Atlantic, but they might be able to fly a very small plane for 1,000 kilometres. And so battery electric solutions may come in for that very small part of the market. But for the much larger regional market, trips of up to 2,000 kilometres with planes up to around 200 people, it may well be that hydrogen can provide that solution more efficiently in terms of the renewable energy use than synthetic fuels can. And that is a sizable part of the regional market in Europe. But if we want to look to the long haul and the very biggest planes, then undoubtedly it will be synthetic fuels that dominate in that sector. So my final messages to you today are quite simple. The decarbonisation of transport is possible, but it will be largely achieved through fuel switching to and driven by renewable electricity. That renewable electricity will not be in infinite supply, and therefore we need to use it as efficiently as we can. That means wherever we can use it directly or in batteries, we should do so. Where that is not a viable solution, hydrogen or ammonia may be the best option, but synthetic fuels will only be viable where they have no alternative, and that means aviation. E-fuels are likely, therefore, to be restricted to decarbonising long-haul aviation in particular, but we might see some smaller roles for hydrogen on shorter flights. And finally, public policy will be absolutely key to driving this transition, and it won't happen quickly enough without considerable public intervention, including regulation to push the car industry. And I'll be pleased to talk about what sorts of interventions are needed in the panel discussion. thank you for your time, and I hope that's been of use and informative to you.